Imagine waking up in complete darkness. You can't move. You can't scream. Your hands touch wood inches from your face. You're in a coffin, 6 feet underground, with only hours of air left. This isn't a nightmare, it's exactly what happened to Michelle Renee in 2019. Kidnapped, drugged, and buried alive in a makeshift coffin with a limited air supply, Michelle had 72 hours to escape or die. With nothing but a lighter, a water bottle, and her will to survive, she clawed her way through 6 feet of dirt to freedom. This is the most terrifying survival story you'll ever hear. This is how Michelle Renee survived being buried alive. Before we dive into Michelle's nightmare and incredible survival, please subscribe to Anteph Life Tales right now. This story is absolutely insane and you won't believe how it ends. Hit that bell notification so you never miss stories like this. Drop a comment below telling me, what would you do if you woke up buried alive? How would you survive? I want to hear your survival strategies. Also, this video is going to be intense, so buckle up. Now let's go back to the day Michelle's life changed forever and discover how she survived the impossible. Michelle Renee was 32 years old in 2019, living in rural Georgia, working as a veterinary technician. She loved animals, lived alone in a small house on the outskirts of town, and was known for her kindness and willingness to help anyone in need. Michelle had a routine. She worked long hours at the animal clinic, came home to her 2 rescue dogs, and lived a quiet, predictable life. She wasn't wealthy, didn't have enemies, and certainly never imagined she'd become the victim of one of the most horrifying crimes imaginable. Michelle was single, independent, and capable. But none of that prepared her for what was about to happen. October 12, 2019, started like any other Saturday for Michelle. She woke up early, fed her dogs, and headed to the animal clinic for a half-day shift. She treated several animals that morning, vaccinations, checkups, nothing unusual. Her co-workers later remembered Michelle being in good spirits, talking about plans to reorganize her garage that afternoon. Around noon, Michelle left the clinic and stopped at a local hardware store to buy supplies. Security footage captured her browsing the store, selecting items, and checking out around 12:30 p.m. She seemed relaxed, completely unaware she was being watched. That was the last normal moment of Michelle's life. What Michelle didn't know was that she'd been under surveillance for weeks. A man named David Carpenter, 45 years old, had become obsessed with Michelle after seeing her at the animal clinic where she worked. Carpenter had brought his dog in for treatment months earlier, and something about Michelle triggered an obsession. He began following her, learning her routine, studying her habits. Carpenter was a loner with a disturbing history, prior arrests for stalking, restraining orders from multiple women, and a fascination with true crime stories about kidnapping and burial. He'd been planning Michelle's abduction meticulously, preparing a location, gathering supplies, waiting for the perfect opportunity. Around 2:30 p.m. on October 12, David Carpenter approached Michelle's house. He'd been watching from a distance, ensuring no neighbors were outside. Carpenter walked to Michelle's front door and knocked, pretending to be lost and needing directions. Michelle, trusting and kind, opened the door. Within seconds, Carpenter forced his way inside, overpowering Michelle before she could scream or fight back. He injected her with a powerful sedative he'd obtained illegally. Michelle's dogs barked frantically but couldn't stop him. Within minutes, Michelle was unconscious. Carpenter carried her limp body to his van parked nearby, covered with a tarp. By 3 p.m., Michelle's nightmare had begun. David Carpenter had spent months preparing for this. In a remote wooded area 30 miles from Michelle's home, he'd dug a grave, 7 feet deep, carefully measured. Inside that grave, he'd placed a homemade wooden coffin he'd constructed himself. The coffin was crude but functional, 6 feet long, 2 feet wide, basic pine wood. Carpenter had installed a small PVC pipe running from the coffin to the surface, an air tube to keep Michelle alive temporarily. He'd also placed items in the coffin: a small flashlight, a lighter, a water bottle, and a note explaining his twisted plan. This wasn't about ransom or assault, this was about power, control, and inflicting maximum psychological torture. Michelle Renee regained consciousness slowly, her mind foggy from the sedative. The first thing she noticed was complete darkness, not dim light, but absolute black nothingness. She tried to sit up and immediately hit her head on something hard inches above her face. Panic exploded in her chest. Michelle's hands flew up, touching wood on all sides, above, beside her, beneath her. She was enclosed in a box. Michelle tried to scream but the sound went nowhere, absorbed by wood and dirt. She kicked at the sides frantically. Nothing moved. The air felt thick, limited, stale. Michelle's heart pounded so hard she thought it would burst. Then memory flooded back, the man at her door. Michelle's first hour underground was pure panic. She screamed until her throat was raw, knowing nobody could hear but unable to stop. She pounded on the coffin lid with her fists until her hands were bruised and bleeding. She kicked at the sides, trying to break through the wood. Nothing worked. The coffin was solid, and even if she broke through, Michelle didn't know how much dirt was above her. Claustrophobia crushed her chest. She hyperventilated, wasting precious oxygen. Michelle's mind raced with terrifying thoughts. How much air did she have? Was she going to die here? Would anyone find her body? But then, through the panic, survival instinct kicked in. Michelle forced herself to breathe slowly. Michelle forced herself to calm down and assess her situation logically. She was in a wooden coffin underground. How far underground? She didn't know. Michelle felt around in the darkness and discovered items placed in the coffin with her. Her hands found a small flashlight. She turned it on and nearly cried with relief at the light. The coffin was about 6 feet long, 2 feet wide, 18 inches tall, barely enough room to move. Michelle found a water bottle, maybe 16 ounces. A lighter. And a piece of paper. Michelle held the paper to the flashlight and read the note. It was from her abductor, explaining she'd been buried alive, that she had approximately 72 hours of air through a PVC pipe above her. Michelle examined the coffin ceiling carefully with her flashlight. In the upper corner, she found the PVC pipe opening, about 2 inches in diameter, running straight up through the dirt to the surface. Michelle pressed her face to the opening and breathed deeply. Fresh air flowed through. This pipe was keeping her alive. Michelle tried yelling through the pipe, hoping someone might hear. Her voice echoed back. Nothing. The woods were remote. Nobody was coming. Michelle realized she couldn't wait for rescue. She had to save herself. But how? The coffin was solid wood. The dirt above her weighed tons. Even if she broke through the coffin, how would she dig through 6 or 7 feet of dirt? Michelle made critical decisions about resource management. First, the flashlight. She couldn't keep it on constantly, batteries wouldn't last. She'd use light only when absolutely necessary. Second, water. 16 ounces wasn't much. She'd ration it carefully, small sips, only when absolutely needed. Third, air. The pipe provided oxygen, but Michelle didn't know for how long. She had to breathe slowly, stay calm, conserve oxygen. Fourth, energy. She couldn't waste strength on useless panic or futile pounding. Every action had to be calculated toward escape. Michelle turned off the flashlight to save battery and sat in darkness, thinking. She was a veterinary technician, she understood biology, anatomy, survival mechanisms. Animals trapped underground sometimes dug their way out. Michelle decided to test the coffin's structural integrity. She turned on the flashlight briefly, examining the wood. The lid was solid but the sides seemed slightly weaker. Michelle positioned herself and kicked hard at one side panel. Pain shot through her leg, but the wood didn't break. She kicked again. And again. After a dozen kicks, Michelle heard a crack. The wood was splintering. Encouraged, she kicked harder. Finally, a board cracked partially. Michelle used her hands to pull at the broken wood. Splinters drove into her fingers, but she didn't care. She managed to break off a piece of wood about 12 inches long. Through the gap, Michelle felt dirt. Packed hard, but not concrete. Maybe she could dig. Michelle had made a critical mistake. When she broke through the coffin side and started digging, she hadn't considered that the dirt above would collapse inward. Now dirt was pouring into the coffin through the broken section. Michelle panicked, trying to push the dirt back, but it kept coming. Within minutes, the coffin was half filled with loose dirt. Michelle's breathing space was cut in half. She couldn't move her legs anymore, they were buried in dirt. The air pipe was still functioning, but barely. Dirt had partially blocked it. Michelle was suffocating. She spit dirt from her mouth, coughing violently. This was it, she was going to die. But then, Michelle's survival instinct kicked in again. Michelle lay in the darkness, covered in dirt, exhausted, and terrified, but also thinking clearly now. Her first escape attempt had nearly killed her. She'd learned a crucial lesson: she couldn't just break out randomly. Any escape had to be controlled, calculated, and careful. Random digging would cause collapse and suffocation. Michelle needed a better plan. She thought about mine tunnels, about how they were reinforced to prevent collapse. She thought about animals that burrow, how they create stable tunnels. Michelle realized she needed to dig upward, not sideways. She needed to create a vertical shaft, packing dirt tightly around her as she went up, preventing collapse. It would be incredibly difficult, maybe impossible. But it was her only chance. Michelle had no watch, no phone, no way to track time underground. She didn't know if hours or days had passed. The darkness was complete and disorienting. Michelle tried to estimate time by her thirst and hunger levels. She was very thirsty despite rationing water carefully. Her stomach ached with hunger. She guessed she'd been underground for at least 12 hours, maybe longer. The note said she had 72 hours of air. If 12 hours had passed, that meant 60 hours remained. But Michelle didn't trust that number. What if the air pipe got blocked? What if the calculation was wrong? She couldn't wait. She had to escape as soon as possible. Michelle also thought about the outside world. Were people looking for her? Michelle prepared carefully for her second escape attempt. She'd learned from her mistake. This time, she would dig upward through the coffin lid rather than sideways. She positioned herself on her back, lying in the dirt that had already collapsed into the coffin. Michelle used the broken board as a digging tool. She turned on the flashlight briefly, examining the coffin lid directly above her chest. It was solid wood, but Michelle noticed the boards ran lengthwise. If she could break through between two boards, she might create a narrow opening. Michelle began scraping with the broken board, working at a seam between two lid boards. The work was exhausting. Her arms ached. Splinters cut her hands. Michelle finally broke through the coffin lid. A piece of wood splintered away, creating an opening about 6 inches wide. Immediately, dirt began falling through. Michelle was ready this time. She used her hands to control the dirt flow, letting only small amounts through at a time. She packed the dirt around her body, creating a more stable base. Once the initial dirt fall stopped, Michelle looked up through the hole with her flashlight. All she could see was more dirt, packed hard, dark brown, extending upward as far as the light reached. Michelle couldn't see the surface. She didn't know if she was under 3 feet of dirt or 10 feet. But she had an opening now. She could start digging upward. Digging upward was harder than Michelle could have imagined. Every inch took tremendous effort. She would scrape and loosen dirt with her broken board, let it fall onto her chest and face, then painfully push it down around her body to make room for more. The work was claustrophobic and terrifying. Dirt constantly fell on her face. She had to keep her eyes closed most of the time, working blind by feel. Several times, larger chunks of dirt collapsed onto her, nearly burying her face completely. Michelle would have to stop, clear the dirt away from her nose and mouth, and carefully pack it down before continuing. Her arms screamed with exhaustion. Her hands were bleeding from splinters and scraping against rocks in the dirt. Michelle had completely lost track of time. In the absolute darkness underground, with no external reference points, hours blurred together. Was it day or night above ground? How long had she been digging? Michelle's body gave some clues. She was desperately thirsty despite her careful water rationing. She'd finished the 16-ounce water bottle hours ago. Her last sips were long gone. Dehydration was setting in. She felt weak, dizzy, confused. Her mouth was so dry she could barely swallow. Hunger gnawed at her stomach constantly, though that was less urgent than thirst. Michelle guessed she'd been underground for at least 24 hours, maybe longer. That meant she had perhaps 48 hours of air remaining. Michelle's body was failing. Days of being buried alive were taking their toll. Dehydration caused severe headaches, her head pounded with every movement. Her lips were cracked and bleeding. Her throat was so dry she could barely swallow. Hunger caused constant stomach cramps and weakness. She felt lightheaded and dizzy whenever she exerted herself. Her muscles ached from the cramped position and constant digging. Her hands were destroyed, bleeding, covered in splinters, fingernails broken and torn. Her arms felt like they weighed 100 pounds each. Lifting them to dig was almost impossible. Michelle's breathing was labored. The air felt thinner, though she didn't know if that was real or psychological. Was the air pipe still working? Was oxygen decreasing? The mental torture was worse than the physical. Michelle fought constant psychological battles in the darkness. Despair threatened to overwhelm her regularly. What if she was digging in the wrong direction? What if she was going sideways instead of straight up? What if she'd been digging for days and was only inches higher? What if the surface was still 10 feet above her? What if she ran out of strength before reaching it? Michelle's mind played cruel tricks. Sometimes she imagined she heard voices above ground, people searching for her, calling her name, but they were hallucinations. Sometimes she thought she saw light through the dirt, only to realize it was her oxygen-deprived brain creating false hope. Michelle talked to herself constantly, fighting off madness. After what felt like an eternity of digging, Michelle had no idea if it had been 1 day or 3, something changed. She was scraping at the dirt above her when her broken board suddenly punched through into nothing. Empty space. Michelle froze, afraid to hope. She scraped more carefully. The dirt above her felt different, looser, less compact. She dug faster, more desperately. Her hands broke through the surface suddenly, emerging into open air. Michelle gasped, hardly able to believe it. She'd reached the surface. She'd actually done it. She'd dug her way out of a grave. Michelle widened the opening frantically, pushing dirt aside, creating a space large enough for her head. She pulled herself up with her last reserves of strength. Michelle pulled herself completely out of the hole she'd dug, collapsing on the forest floor. She lay there for several minutes, gasping, crying, unable to move. She'd survived. She'd actually survived being buried alive. Michelle looked back at the hole she'd emerged from. It was roughly circular, about 12 inches wide, disappearing down into darkness. She'd dug through approximately 6.5 feet of packed dirt with nothing but a broken board and her bare hands. It seemed impossible, but she'd done it. Michelle examined her surroundings. She was in dense woods, trees everywhere, no buildings visible, no roads, no people. It was early morning, she guessed, based on the gray pre-dawn light. Michelle tried to stand but her legs wouldn't work properly. Michelle was free from the grave, but far from safe. She was in the middle of remote woods with no idea which direction led to civilization. She was severely dehydrated, starving, injured, and could barely walk. Michelle's veterinary training kicked in. She assessed her condition clinically. Severe dehydration, life-threatening. Needed water immediately. Malnutrition, serious but not immediately fatal. Injuries, hands destroyed, possible infections, but manageable. Hypothermia risk, moderate. October nights were cold. Michelle looked for water sources. She listened carefully and heard distant running water. A creek or stream. She crawled toward the sound, moving slowly through underbrush. Every movement hurt. Her hands screamed in pain. But Michelle kept moving. After what felt like an hour of crawling, she found water. Michelle rested by the stream, regaining some strength from the water. She needed to find civilization, but which direction? Michelle listened carefully for sounds, cars, planes, people. She heard nothing but forest sounds. She looked at the sun's position. It was rising, meaning that direction was east. Michelle remembered her abductor had driven for what felt like 30 to 40 minutes before she lost consciousness. That could mean she was anywhere from 20 to 50 miles from her home, depending on speed and route. Michelle decided to follow the stream downhill. Streams flow to larger water sources. Larger water sources mean human settlement. It was basic logic. Michelle started crawling downstream, staying close to the water. Her legs were starting to regain some feeling. After crawling for what Michelle estimated was 3 or 4 hours, following the stream downstream, she heard something that made her heart leap, a car engine in the distance. Michelle changed direction immediately, crawling toward the sound. Through the trees ahead, she saw it, a dirt road. It was unpaved and looked rarely used, but it was a road, meaning potential rescue. Michelle dragged herself to the road's edge and collapsed. She was too weak to go further. She would wait here and hope someone drove past. Michelle lay on the roadside, drifting in and out of consciousness. Hours might have passed, or minutes, she couldn't tell. Then, she heard another engine approaching. A pickup truck was coming down the road. Michelle forced herself to raise one destroyed, bloody hand. The man who found Michelle was a local farmer named Tom Reynolds, checking on his back property. Tom immediately called 911, giving their location. While waiting for emergency services, Tom gave Michelle water and covered her with a blanket from his truck. Michelle was barely conscious but managed to whisper, "Buried alive. Escaped." Tom didn't understand at first. He thought Michelle meant a building collapse or mine accident. Within 15 minutes, paramedics arrived, followed by police. Michelle was loaded into an ambulance. Paramedics were shocked by her condition: severe dehydration, malnutrition, hypothermia, and injuries consistent with someone who'd been buried underground. Michelle kept repeating, "He buried me. Woods. Coffin. I dug out." Police didn't fully believe her initially. The story seemed impossible. Michelle arrived at the hospital in critical condition. Doctors immediately started 4 fluids to combat severe dehydration. She'd lost 15 pounds during her underground ordeal. Her hands required extensive treatment, multiple splinters removed, cuts cleaned and bandaged, several fingernails completely torn off. Michelle's legs had suffered nerve damage from prolonged compression. Doctors weren't sure if she'd regain full mobility. She had infections starting in multiple wounds. Michelle was covered in bruises, scratches, and dirt embedded so deep in her skin it took hours of gentle cleaning to remove. But physically, Michelle would recover. The psychological damage was another matter. Michelle kept having panic attacks in the hospital. Anytime lights were dimmed or she was left alone in darkness, she'd start screaming. Once Michelle was stable enough to speak coherently, police took her detailed statement. Michelle described everything: the man who'd come to her door, the abduction, waking up buried alive in a coffin, the 72-hour timeline mentioned in the note, the PVC air pipe, her desperate escape by digging 6.5 feet through dirt. Police were astounded. They'd never heard of anyone surviving being buried alive like this. Michelle described her abductor as best she could: male, approximately 45 years old, average height, brown hair, no distinctive features she could recall from the brief encounter. She remembered he'd mentioned bringing his dog to the clinic where she worked. Police immediately began checking records at Michelle's workplace, looking for patients matching that description. Police discovered the burial site Michelle had escaped from, and what they found was horrifying. The homemade coffin was still in the ground, partially filled with collapsed dirt. The PVC air pipe was visible, running from the coffin to the surface. Police carefully excavated the entire area, documenting everything. The coffin was crude but functional, basic pine wood, roughly constructed. Inside, they found the items Michelle mentioned: the flashlight she'd used with battery dead, the lighter, the empty water bottle, and most chillingly, the note. Police read the note and were sickened. It described in detail how the perpetrator had buried Michelle alive with 72 hours of air, intending to return and rescue her to create a trauma bond and Stockholm Syndrome. The note was evidence of premeditation and extreme psychological sadism. Police checked records at the veterinary clinic where Michelle worked, focusing on male patients around 45 years old who'd brought dogs in during the past year. They found several possibilities, but one stood out: David Carpenter. Carpenter had brought his dog in 6 months earlier for treatment. Staff remembered him because he'd asked unusual questions about Michelle: whether she worked every day, what her schedule was, whether she lived alone. At the time, it seemed like awkward flirting, but in hindsight it was clearly surveillance. Police ran Carpenter's background and found exactly what they feared: prior arrests for stalking, multiple restraining orders from women, psychiatric evaluations describing him as having an obsessive personality disorder, and most disturbing, browser history from a previous investigation showing fascination with kidnapping and live burial cases. David Carpenter had vanished. Police believed he'd planned to return to Michelle's burial site, discovered she'd escaped, and fled. Carpenter's house was searched thoroughly. Police found disturbing evidence: detailed plans for Michelle's abduction, surveillance photos of her taken over several weeks, research on suffocation timelines and air requirements for buried victims, and most chilling, a list of other potential victims, women Carpenter had been stalking, all of whom fit Michelle's profile. Police warned these women immediately and provided protection. A massive manhunt was launched. Carpenter's photo was broadcast on news stations statewide. Tips poured in. Carpenter was spotted at a gas station near the Tennessee border. Police moved in, but he fled before they could apprehend him. A high-speed chase ensued on rural highways. David Carpenter was pulled from the crashed vehicle, handcuffed, and placed under arrest. He'd suffered serious injuries in the crash: broken ribs, internal bleeding, head trauma. Paramedics treated him at the scene before transporting him to the hospital under police guard. Carpenter would survive. He'd face justice for what he'd done to Michelle. In the ambulance, Carpenter remained silent, refusing to answer questions. At the hospital, police read him his rights formally. Carpenter asked for a lawyer and said nothing else. Police didn't need his confession, they had overwhelming evidence. DNA from a cigarette butt at the burial site matched Carpenter's DNA on file from previous arrests. The note found in the coffin had Carpenter's fingerprints. Surveillance footage showed Carpenter purchasing the PVC pipe and lumber used to construct the coffin. David Carpenter faced an extensive list of charges. First-degree kidnapping with intent to inflict bodily harm. Attempted murder with extreme cruelty. False imprisonment. Aggravated assault. Stalking. And the prosecutor added a special circumstance: torture. The burial alive constituted torture under state law, which carried enhanced sentencing. If convicted on all charges, Carpenter faced life imprisonment without possibility of parole, or potentially even the death penalty. The prosecutor was determined to seek the maximum sentence. What Carpenter had done to Michelle was one of the most sadistic crimes in state history. The case drew national media attention. Woman buried alive digs her way out after 3 days, became headline news. Michelle's incredible survival story captivated the country. But Michelle herself wanted nothing to do with publicity. Michelle's story became national news. Media outlets called her a real-life buried alive survivor, comparing her ordeal to horror movies but emphasizing this was horrifically real. News helicopters flew over the burial site where Michelle had been found. Reporters tried constantly to interview Michelle, but she refused all media requests. She was too traumatized to discuss publicly what had happened. True crime documentaries wanted to cover her case. Book publishers offered deals for Michelle to write her memoir. Michelle declined everything. She wanted privacy to heal. But the media attention was relentless. Reporters camped outside the hospital, then later outside her home. Michelle felt violated all over again, first by Carpenter, now by public intrusion. She eventually issued one statement through her lawyer: "I survived something no person should ever experience. I'm grateful to be alive." Michelle's physical injuries healed within weeks, but psychological healing took much longer. She was diagnosed with severe PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder. Michelle couldn't sleep without lights on. She couldn't be in enclosed spaces without panicking. Elevators were impossible. She avoided basements. She couldn't drive through tunnels. Even small rooms made her hyperventilate. Michelle had constant nightmares about being buried again, waking up screaming multiple times per night. She attended intensive therapy 3 times per week. Her therapist specialized in trauma from extreme circumstances. Michelle learned breathing techniques for panic attacks. She practiced exposure therapy gradually, spending brief periods in darker rooms, slowly increasing tolerance. Michelle also dealt with survivor's guilt. Why had she survived when others might not have? Recovery was slow, painful, and ongoing. 2 months after her rescue, Michelle returned to her home for the first time. She'd been staying with her sister while recovering, too afraid to be alone. Walking into her house was traumatic. This was where Carpenter had grabbed her, where her nightmare began. Michelle stood in her doorway, shaking, unable to enter. Her sister held her hand for support. Michelle finally stepped inside. Everything looked the same, but felt different. The house that had been her safe space now felt contaminated by Carpenter's presence. Michelle's dogs went crazy with joy seeing her. They'd been cared for by neighbors but missed Michelle desperately. Seeing her dogs helped Michelle feel grounded. She was home. She'd survived. But Michelle couldn't sleep in her house that first night. She stayed at her sister's. 6 months after Michelle's rescue, David Carpenter's trial began. The courtroom was packed, media, curious onlookers, Michelle's supporters. Carpenter sat at the defense table, showing no emotion. He'd pleaded not guilty to all charges despite overwhelming evidence. His defense strategy was to claim Michelle had consented to being buried as part of some bizarre roleplay scenario gone wrong. It was absurd, offensive, and enraged Michelle. The prosecution presented their case methodically: surveillance photos Carpenter had taken of Michelle, the meticulously planned burial site, the note describing his intentions, DNA evidence, cell phone records, everything. Witnesses testified: Tom Reynolds, who found Michelle, police investigators, forensic experts, Michelle's co-workers describing Carpenter's creepy behavior. The evidence was overwhelming. Carpenter's defense was non-existent. The trial lasted 3 weeks. The most emotional moment of the trial was Michelle's testimony. She took the stand, visibly shaking, facing her abductor for the first time since the rescue. Michelle described in detail her abduction, waking up buried alive, the terror of being in that coffin, the desperate hours spent digging through 6 feet of dirt to survive. The courtroom was silent except for Michelle's voice and occasional sobs from spectators. Michelle described her injuries, her ongoing PTSD, how Carpenter had stolen her sense of safety and normalcy. She looked directly at Carpenter and said, "You tried to bury me alive. You thought I would die or be so broken that I'd become dependent on you. But I survived. I'm here. And you're going to prison forever." Carpenter showed no reaction. The jury was visibly moved by Michelle's testimony. After 3 weeks of trial and only 4 hours of jury deliberation, the verdict came, guilty. Guilty on all counts. First-degree kidnapping. Attempted murder. Torture. Stalking. False imprisonment. Aggravated assault. The jury found David Carpenter guilty of every single charge. When the verdict was read, Michelle collapsed in tears, not of sadness, but relief. Justice had been served. Carpenter showed no emotion, staring straight ahead. The judge scheduled sentencing for 2 weeks later. The prosecutor told Michelle they would seek the maximum sentence possible under state law. Michelle's family embraced her outside the courtroom. After 6 months of waiting, wondering, and reliving her nightmare, Michelle finally had closure. Carpenter had been found guilty. He would never hurt anyone again. The nightmare was officially over. At sentencing, David Carpenter faced the judge who would determine his fate. The prosecution argued for the maximum, life without possibility of parole. They presented evidence of Carpenter's prior stalking offenses, his continued danger to society, and the extreme psychological torture he'd inflicted on Michelle. Michelle gave a victim impact statement, describing how Carpenter's crime had destroyed her sense of safety and changed her life forever. The defense asked for leniency, citing Carpenter's mental health issues. The judge wasn't swayed. The judge called Carpenter's crime one of the most sadistic and premeditated acts of cruelty he'd seen in 30 years on the bench. Sentence: life imprisonment without possibility of parole, plus an additional 30 years on other charges, to be served consecutively. David Carpenter would die in prison. With Carpenter sentenced to life, Michelle could finally try to move forward. But recovery wasn't linear. Some days were better than others. Michelle still struggled with PTSD. She couldn't watch horror movies or shows about kidnapping. She avoided news stories about similar crimes. She still slept with lights on. But slowly, gradually, Michelle was reclaiming her life. She started working again at the veterinary clinic, though only part-time initially. Being around animals helped her heal. Michelle moved to a new house. She couldn't stay in the place where Carpenter had grabbed her. She adopted a large dog for protection and companionship. Michelle continued therapy weekly. She joined a support group for crime victims. She was surviving, but more than that, she was starting to live again. As Michelle healed, she began advocacy work to help other crime victims. She spoke at victim support groups, sharing her story of survival and resilience. Michelle advocated for better victim resources and faster trauma response. She worked with lawmakers on legislation to increase penalties for kidnapping and stalking crimes. Michelle also worked with law enforcement, teaching them about the psychological impact of extreme trauma on victims. She turned her nightmare into purpose. Michelle said, "Carpenter tried to bury me and leave me for dead. Instead, I survived, and now I use my voice to help others. That's how I win." Michelle's advocacy work gave her life meaning beyond the trauma. She was no longer defined by what Carpenter did to her. She was defined by how she responded. Police investigation into David Carpenter continued after his conviction. Detectives discovered evidence suggesting Michelle might not have been his first victim. The list of other women found in Carpenter's house included detailed surveillance notes going back years. Police contacted these women. Several reported that Carpenter had stalked them, appeared at their homes uninvited, followed them, but stopped before escalating to violence. Police believed Michelle was meant to be Carpenter's first completed kidnapping, but they also investigated unsolved disappearances of women in the region over the past decade. Did Carpenter practice his burial technique on others? Police found no definitive evidence of other victims, but the question haunted investigators. Michelle struggled with this possibility. If Carpenter had killed before and police hadn't known, did that mean someone else had died buried alive without ever escaping? Experts analyzed Michelle's survival and were astounded. Surviving 3 days buried alive in a coffin with limited air should have been impossible. Experts calculated that with the PVC air pipe Carpenter installed, Michelle had approximately 72 to 80 hours of breathable air, assuming the pipe remained clear. Michelle had escaped after roughly 60 to 65 hours underground based on timeline reconstruction. She was within hours of her air running out when she reached the surface. The physical feat of digging 6.5 feet vertically through packed dirt with only a broken board and bare hands was considered nearly impossible. Experts said most people in Michelle's situation would have panicked, used up oxygen too quickly, or given up. Michelle's veterinary training, logical thinking, and extraordinary willpower saved her life. She'd accomplished what survival experts called a statistical impossibility. David Carpenter adjusted to life in prison poorly. Other inmates learned what he'd done, burying a woman alive, and he became a target. In prison culture, crimes against women, especially sadistic ones, are considered particularly heinous. Carpenter was assaulted multiple times by other inmates. He requested protective custody and was moved to a special unit housing vulnerable prisoners. Carpenter maintained his innocence despite the conviction, claiming Michelle had participated willingly. Prison psychiatrists evaluated Carpenter and diagnosed him with narcissistic personality disorder and antisocial traits. He showed no genuine remorse for what he'd done to Michelle. Carpenter filed appeals, all of which were denied. He would spend the rest of his life in a 6-by-8-foot cell, ironic justice, some said. He'd tried to bury Michelle alive. Now he was buried alive in prison. 2 years after her rescue, Michelle marked the anniversary quietly. October 12, 2021, 2 years since the worst day of her life. Michelle didn't celebrate being alive, that felt wrong. Instead, she acknowledged survival. Michelle visited the woods where she'd been buried, accompanied by her sister and her therapist. The burial site had been filled in by police after evidence collection. Michelle stood where her grave had been, remembering the terror but also her strength. She'd clawed her way out of this spot. She'd refused to die. Michelle placed flowers at the site, not to memorialize her near death, but to acknowledge the person she'd been before and the person she'd become after. She was different now. Trauma had changed her. But she was alive, and she was learning to live with what happened. Michelle struggled with relationships after her trauma. She'd been single when Carpenter abducted her. Now, trusting anyone felt impossible. She tried dating but had panic attacks when men approached her. Being alone with men triggered her PTSD. Michelle worked with her therapist on this. Slowly, she built trust. She met someone, a gentle, patient man named Marcus who worked at the animal clinic. He knew her story and never pushed her. Their relationship developed slowly over months. Michelle had flashbacks and panic attacks. Marcus learned to recognize triggers and help her through them. It wasn't easy. Michelle said, "Carpenter tried to destroy my ability to trust, to love, to live normally. Rebuilding that is the hardest part of recovery." But Michelle was trying. That was what mattered. 3 years after Michelle's rescue, a major true crime documentary series approached her about featuring her story. Initially, Michelle refused. She didn't want her trauma exploited for entertainment. But the producers promised a sensitive, educational approach focusing on survival, not sensationalism. They wanted to showcase Michelle's strength and help other trauma survivors. After much consideration and discussion with her therapist, Michelle agreed on her terms. She'd have creative approval, portions of proceeds would go to victim advocacy organizations, and the focus would be on survival and recovery, not graphic details of her torture. The documentary Buried, Michelle's Story aired in 2022. It was powerful, moving, and educational. Michelle's bravery in sharing her story helped countless other trauma survivors feel less alone. As part of her exposure therapy, Michelle's therapist suggested an extreme but potentially healing exercise, confronting the actual coffin Carpenter had built. Police had kept it as evidence after the trial. Michelle was terrified but agreed. In a controlled setting with her therapist present, Michelle saw the coffin again for the first time since escaping. It looked smaller than she remembered. Less terrifying in daylight, outside of the ground. Michelle touched the wood, feeling where she'd broken through. She saw her blood stains still visible on the boards. She looked at the air pipe opening that had kept her alive. Michelle didn't get into the coffin, that would be too much, but seeing it removed some of its psychological power. It was just wood. She'd been stronger than wood and dirt. She'd survived. 5 years after his conviction, David Carpenter died in prison. He was found unresponsive in his cell at age 50. Cause of death was ruled as complications from an inmate assault. Carpenter had been beaten severely by another prisoner weeks earlier and never fully recovered. Prison officials investigated the assault but no charges were filed. Carpenter's death brought complicated feelings for Michelle. She'd wanted him to suffer in prison for decades, to experience a fraction of the terror he'd inflicted on her. His death at 50 felt too easy, too quick. But it also brought finality. Michelle would never have to worry about him getting paroled, escaping, or harming anyone else. Carpenter was gone. Michelle said at a press conference, "I survived what he tried to do to me. He didn't survive prison. Justice served itself." Michelle dedicated herself increasingly to helping other trauma survivors. She founded a non-profit organization called Buried But Not Broken that provided resources, therapy funding, and support groups for victims of violent crimes, particularly kidnapping and assault survivors. Michelle spoke at schools, community centers, and conferences about survival, resilience, and recovery. She trained law enforcement on trauma-informed interviewing of victims. Michelle also lobbied for legislation improving victim compensation funds and mandating trauma counseling for violent crime victims. Her organization grew, helping hundreds of survivors. Michelle said, "Carpenter tried to bury me and silence me forever. Instead, I'm louder than ever, helping others find their voices." Michelle's advocacy became her purpose, transforming her trauma into meaningful impact for others. She'd turned her worst nightmare into her greatest strength. 5 years after her rescue, Michelle's physical injuries had healed remarkably well. Her hands, which had been destroyed during her escape, regained most functionality, though she had permanent scarring and some nerve damage. Her fingernails grew back, though some remained misshapen. The nerve damage in her legs from being compressed in dirt resolved gradually. Michelle could walk, run, and live normally. She maintained physical fitness, running marathons to prove to herself that her body was strong and capable. Michelle said running helped her process trauma. Each mile was a victory over Carpenter's attempt to break her. Doctors called her physical recovery extraordinary given the severity of her injuries. Michelle credited her veterinary training. Understanding anatomy and healing helped her rehabilitate effectively. Physically, Michelle was proof that the human body could survive and recover from extreme trauma. 7 years after her rescue, Michelle published a memoir titled 6 Feet Under: My Fight to Survive Being Buried Alive. The book was raw, honest, and powerful. Michelle detailed not just her burial and escape, but her childhood, her life before Carpenter, the trauma of the attack, her recovery journey, her PTSD struggles, and her advocacy work. The book became a bestseller, resonating with trauma survivors worldwide. Critics praised Michelle's writing for its honesty and lack of self-pity. She didn't portray herself as a perfect hero, she wrote about her panic, her mistakes, her ongoing struggles. Michelle donated a significant portion of book proceeds to victim advocacy organizations. The book's success gave Michelle a platform to reach even more survivors. It also served as permanent documentation of what Carpenter did to her. Her story would outlive them both. Michelle developed personal rituals for marking October 12, the anniversary of her abduction and burial. Each year, she took the day off work and spent it in reflection and renewal. She visited the burial site and placed flowers. She wrote in a journal, documenting her growth over the past year. She met with her therapist for an extended session processing her feelings. She called other survivors she'd helped through her nonprofit, checking on them and drawing strength from their connections. Michelle also celebrated her survival. She treated herself to something special, acknowledging that she'd made it another year. By year 10, the anniversary was less painful, more reflective. Michelle said, "October 12th used to be the worst day of my life. Now it's a reminder that I'm stronger than anything trying to break me." She'd reclaimed the day. People often asked Michelle if she'd forgiven David Carpenter. The question frustrated her. Michelle said, "Forgiveness isn't something I owe my abuser. He buried me alive and showed no remorse. Forgiveness is for situations involving genuine regret and change. Carpenter had neither." Michelle clarified that refusing to forgive didn't mean holding on to hate, she'd released the anger because carrying it hurt her more than him. But forgiveness? No. Michelle explained that society often pressures victims to forgive as if it's required for healing. "I've healed tremendously without forgiving him," Michelle said. "I've moved forward. I have a full life. I help other survivors. And I've never forgiven him. Those things aren't mutually exclusive." Michelle's stance challenged conventional narratives about trauma recovery. Healing doesn't require forgiveness. It requires processing, support, and choosing to rebuild. Michelle became an advocate for technological improvements in missing person investigations. Her case had highlighted gaps in emergency response for buried alive victims. Michelle worked with tech companies developing ground-penetrating radar devices that could detect voids underground, like coffins or buried containers. She also advocated for improved 911 systems allowing victims to send silent distress signals if they couldn't speak. Michelle pushed for better surveillance technology in rural areas where abductions often occurred. She spoke at technology conferences, encouraging innovation in victim recovery systems. Michelle said, "Technology saved my life. The PVC pipe Carpenter installed kept me alive long enough to escape. Imagine if victims had actual emergency beacons or ways to signal rescuers underground. We can develop these things." Michelle's advocacy bridged crime prevention and technological innovation, potentially saving future victims. Michelle frequently spoke at high schools and colleges about personal safety, awareness, and survival. She taught students, especially young women, to trust their instincts about people who made them uncomfortable. Michelle described the warning signs Carpenter had shown, asking intrusive questions, appearing at unexpected places, violating boundaries. She taught students that politeness shouldn't override safety concerns. "I opened my door to Carpenter because I wanted to be helpful," Michelle explained. Women especially are socialized to be polite and accommodating, even when someone makes us uncomfortable. That conditioning can be dangerous. Michelle's talks weren't about victim blaming, she emphasized that Carpenter alone was responsible for his crime. But she empowered students with information about recognizing predatory behavior and strategies for staying safe. Her talks were popular and impactful, reaching thousands of young people annually. Michelle's therapy evolved over the years. Initially, treatment focused on immediate trauma processing, helping Michelle cope with PTSD symptoms, panic attacks, and nightmares. Over time, therapy shifted to deeper work on identity and meaning-making. Who was Michelle beyond the trauma? How could she integrate this experience into her life narrative without letting it define her entirely? Michelle worked on post-traumatic growth, the phenomenon where trauma survivors develop increased resilience, deeper relationships, greater appreciation for life, and stronger sense of purpose. Michelle said, "I'll never be grateful for what Carpenter did to me. But I'm grateful for who I've become in response, stronger, more compassionate, more purposeful." Michelle's therapist helped her see her survival story as evidence of her inherent strength, not something Carpenter gave her. That reframing was powerful and healing. 10 years after her rescue, Michelle reflected on her journey from victim to survivor to advocate. She'd helped hundreds of trauma survivors through her nonprofit. She'd influenced legislation protecting victims. She'd educated thousands through speaking engagements. She'd published a best-selling memoir. She'd turned her worst nightmare into meaningful impact on the world. Michelle said, "Carpenter tried to bury me and silence me forever. Instead, I'm the loudest I've ever been, helping others and making the world safer. That's my revenge, living fully and helping others do the same." Michelle had a loving partner, a fulfilling career, close friendships, and purpose-driven work. She still had PTSD. She still had hard days. But she'd built a beautiful life on the other side of trauma. Michelle's story wasn't just about surviving being buried alive. It was about surviving trauma and choosing to thrive. Michelle Renee's story shows how human resilience can be. Buried alive in a coffin 6 feet underground with limited air, she refused to give up. Michelle assessed her situation, conserved resources, learned from mistakes, and clawed through dirt with her bare hands to survive. Her experience proves survival is psychological as much as physical, demanding control over panic, despair, and exhaustion. Recovery did not end after escape. With therapy, support, purpose, and community, Michelle rebuilt her life, turned trauma into advocacy, and proved trauma may change you, but it does not have to destroy you. Thanks for watching.